So when you're in the office, you're working really hard, and then you get a phone call that you have to go pick up your kid from school. It's a constant in between. Like, I'm never 100% everywhere, and I have to find what my 100% looks like in different spaces, knowing that I'm kind of always in that in-between state. So it's when you're in one job, you're looking for another job, even when you're on vacation, and then you have to come back from vacation. I know you just went on a vacation. So thinking about the constant transitions that we're dealing with in life, and how do we navigate those, whether they're huge, major life stressors and traumas, or they're these, everyday changes that we need to adapt to. So to me, in between is just how do you make the transition? How do you make the move from one state to another, basically?
Welcome to Peds Doc Talk TV and this episode of the Peds Doc Talk podcast, where you can catch my amazing conversations with guests on the show here on my YouTube channel, or if you prefer audio only, wherever you access podcasts. I'm Dr. Mona Amin, a board-certified pediatrician, lactation consultant, and mom of two, and I'm here to uplift, support, and guide you so you can raise those incredible kids. Let's get to today's amazing conversation.
Today's guest is Dr. Krista Klein, who has a PhD in interdisciplinary education. She's a scholar, an educator, and a mother dedicated to supporting other women who are navigating major transitions in their personal and professional lives. Hello, motherhood. And we're talking today about change. It doesn't have to be so hard, a 5-step framework for navigating those big life transitions. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Krista.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Mona. I'm thrilled to be here.
I'm so happy that we're going to talk about this because we all know that there are major and minor transitions. Sometimes they're not so in your face. And I love that we're going to talk about and normalize that there's many things in our life that can be a big transition and that it doesn't have to be so hard. So before we get into all of that, tell us your story and what led you to this work.
Sure. So I've always worked in higher education, specifically with college students who make that transition from high school to college. So that was my big introduction to change and transition. But I didn't really understand how that affected me until I became a mother myself and really grieved a lot of my identity and how that shifted upon maternity leave and that experience. And I really did not have a great maternity leave experience. And I wanted to go back to work. And I felt like those conversations weren't really happening. So for me, I was able to kind of translate that into some professional presentations across the country that were focusing on supporting women who are returning to work after maternity leave. And that's really where this all started. I then kind of dug into my dissertation, which focused on the experience of undergraduate women. So again, I work in a college setting, but all those themes connected between the women that I talked to who are navigating these life transitions, specifically maternity leave and becoming a mother. So I found all these connections and thought, this is really interesting. And I feel like there's a way to simplify how we navigate change in our lives.
Yeah, this is great. And what was it for you that was so difficult or hard about maternity leave? You said that you were excited about going back to work. I'd love to hear that story.
So I love control.
Yeah. Oh, me too. Well, yes. Yeah.
I love being organized and having things together. And I felt like that was really, truly the first time where I was completely out of control, and being in my work environment allowed me to control some things.
Yeah.
And that made a huge difference, though more deeply, I was really, really struggling with postpartum anxiety and OCD. So I ended up in a lot of therapy, taking medication, doing a lot of work on my own mental health, which is something that played a big part in my research as well, but did not realize that and was kind of curious, when did the alarm bells go off? When does that become super serious? And for me, it was just so gradual that I never saw that it was a huge issue until it had kind of already come to a head. So needed to really take care of myself during that time.
Well, we are two people, two peas in a pod, because I resonate so deeply with that. That lack of control, and how when you become a mom, I don't think those who crave that control forget how hard that transition can be to motherhood because of that, just the fact that it's built in. You're just not going to have predictability. You're not going to have control, especially in that fourth trimester. And normalizing that and the work that you're doing is so important. Let's get into, you talk about this term called living in the in-between. What does that mean for anyone who's not familiar? And I would love to know more about that phrase that you have discussed in your work.
Sure. So I borrowed the phrase from a Mandy Moore song because I am a huge Mandy Moore stan. But
I love her.
yeah, I love her so much. I specifically felt like constantly in these two different states as a parent, as a caregiver, and also acknowledging what you said in the very beginning of how that feels when you're in small transitions too. So when you're in the office, you're working really hard, and then you get a phone call that you have to go pick up your kid from school. It's a constant in between. Like I'm never 100% everywhere, and I have to find what my 100% looks like in different spaces, knowing that I'm kind of always in that in-between state. So it's when you're in one job, you're looking for another job, even when you're on vacation, and then you have to come back from vacation. I know you just went on a vacation.
Yeah.
So thinking about the constant transitions that we're dealing with in life, and how do we navigate those, whether they're huge, major life stressors and traumas, or they're these, everyday changes that we need to adapt to. So to me, in between is just how do you make the transition? How do you make the move from one state to another, basically?
Oh, I love it. And I love that you're not just talking about those big life transitions. Of course, that's what we always think about, right? Maternity leave, becoming a mother, maybe a move, maybe a separation. I mean, those are the things that I think we all put in our forefront of, oh yeah, those are big things that by nature, yeah, those are going to be stressful. But like you said beautifully, that, being the shift, right? Being pulled in many different directions. If you're at work and then your child is sick and you get that phone call from the school, like having to now say, okay, I have to now clear my schedule or put things aside and go handle that. Or you just never know. And life is just this, right? I mean, it is always going to be unpredictable. And so I'm loving that we can have this conversation so that we can hopefully help people who are tuning in. Tell us more about your SNAP to Impact framework. Obviously, this is kind of the core of what we're going to talk about. So tell me more about this.
So it's a little cheesy, but a snap, making change a little bit easier, and then being able to make an impact. So for me, 5-step process that came out in my dissertation research and then aligned with all of the professional work that I've been doing with women who returned to work from maternity leave, paid work. And I noticed kind of these common themes, which is really first, self-reflection, understanding who you are in that moment and knowing that who you are in that moment is different day to day, month to month. So kind of pausing to recognize what are you bringing to the table right now? What's impacting you? That's the reflection part. N is navigating uncertainty, which I mean, sounds so casually easy when I say it like that, but really just kind of understanding what you can and can't control, which is something that we've touched on already, and recognizing that uncertainty is just going to be there. So how do you muddle your way through it?
Yeah.
And I think adapting, being able to understand what it means to change roles quickly, how to be flexible, how to understand when you're mother in that moment, when you're caregiver, maybe for a parent in the next moment, when you're a professional in another moment. So how do you adapt to those roles? And then P, the processing, really grief, burnout, trauma, stress, whatever you're dealing with, and helping you negotiate and navigate the different layers of all of that. Then eventually impact is how do you actually share with others how you've been able to process? How do you make an impact? Which folks in my dissertation really found that to be really important for their journey, is to give them a sense of meaning and how they can commit to serving other people too.
I love it. And is there any part of that we want to dive into? I mean, obviously there's so much that we can elaborate on. I think the self-reflection to me, I think is self-explanatory, but if you want to dive deeper into what that would look like for someone and what you think a lot of people may be missing in self-reflection.
Yeah, so I think I talk a lot about identity, right? And recognizing how you bring yourself into a certain space. So for myself, I am clearly presenting as a white woman, but I have these kind of mental health struggles, these challenges that are really truly part of who I am. And I feel like that's a significant thing that people can think about is what are you bringing in that moment? Are you highly elevated in your stress levels at that moment? Is that something that you're bringing into this transition? Are you grieving? Is that something you're bringing into a change or a transition? In addition to just kind of generally like, oh, well, I'm mother, I'm a professional worker. So like thinking a little bit about what's your state at that moment? What are you carrying at that moment? Did you not sleep well, et cetera, are all parts of that.
And then in terms of that navigating uncertainty. So of course that is easier said than done, but what would be like a tip for you? And I love this because you also have dealt with this yourself, right? I mean, this is not just like from your own education, but this is a personal impact. So maybe adding or tying in a personal, anecdote or whatever you will, about how we can navigate that uncertainty.
Yes, of course. So, I mean, I talked about how much I love control. So, any uncertainty for me is really scary. And the best thing that I've found, and I'll give the example of when my daughter was born, we did not have a traumatic birth experience, but she was turning blue at basically in the first 8 hours and was rushed to the NICU. And the doctor had told me at that moment, she's either in sepsis or she's fine. And
okay,
so
well, that's a great thing for someone who loves control. Yes, especially as a physician, I'm sure that was like, well, what does that even mean?
Yeah, and I think, we all go through these types of experiences where we're like, either the world is crashing down or everything is fine. And to me, I mean, I was not, after having just given birth, I was not in the headspace to like navigate this process with any real clarity. So like kind of just in survival mode at that point. But thinking about similar situations now, what can I control at that moment? I can control how I care for myself, how I manage my relationship with my family. Like I really didn't want to talk to my family at that point. So I had to set a boundary at some point that I did not want to have that conversation. I did not want to post on social media that my daughter was born. There are things that I think I just had to make those decisions of like, these are things I can control in this moment. And so it gave me a little bit more of a sense of confidence that everything might be okay because I was able to pinpoint those small things that I could control at that time.
Oh, I resonate so deeply with that. I had the similar experience of a traumatic birth, but a child who was blue when they were born. That same feeling of wanting to not share photos or even talk to anybody. And I like that we're discussing that because, like you said, that's kind of self-reflection, right? You're in that moment, you're kind of realizing right now what I need is not to socialize and share. Maybe in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I'll be ready.
Right.
But that takes a lot of self-reflection and self-insight that you already had mentioned. And then to be able to better navigate that sort of, I don't know what's going to happen. And, for me, the reason I resonate with that is that because I didn't know what was going to happen with my son medically, I didn't want to have more people asking questions, talking about it. Okay, well, this is going to be like this. And, oh no, be strong. And, just pray or do this. And I'm like, listen, I know all of this to be true, but I need to focus on myself, my child right now. And so, like you said, that navigating the uncertainty by having that self-reflection, I love that you're already adding that S in the N of the SNAP, framework, because it makes a lot of sense, and it's a form of, for me, it was a form of self-protection. And also, finally I was ready to share those photos and share my story, like you, but it's such a personal choice. And I wish more people would listen to this episode and also understand that perspective. Maybe if someone is going through a minor or major life transition and they're needing some space at that moment,
Yeah, and I find that I sometimes feel like I have to make excuses for that. Like, oh, I'm really busy right now, so I'm sorry that I won't answer your text message. Because I also am sometimes like, well, why didn't that person answer me? And I don't take the time to kind of empathize and think about what someone else might be going through too. So it's always a good reminder to talk about that too.
Yeah. And in terms of, the A of the SNAP framework, the adapting to the changing role. So maybe using the example of going to, being a mom postpartum and then going to maternity leave. How can we kind of apply that to that scenario?
Yeah. So I had felt like for me in particular, My very first Mother's Day, my daughter was, I think, almost 6 months old, and I was crying a lot because I
Mm-hmm.
didn't want to celebrate Mother's Day. I didn't feel like a
Yeah.
mother. I didn't
Yeah.
understand what that identity meant. And that's when she was 6 months old. So I had kind of started thinking like, it's been a while.
Yeah.
So this isn't like baby blues. This isn't just hormones. There's like something else going on here. And recognizing the fact that we celebrate caregiving and motherhood in very specific ways, like societally, I guess, in our society. I just wanted to be alone, and I just wanted to like be who I was before becoming a mother. And so really had to kind of think through, okay, how do I adapt to this situation? What can I do to give myself space? And I was also younger. I was in my early 30s, and I felt like developmentally, I just wasn't totally prepared for how to navigate that. So now at my
Yeah.
age, when things like this come up, I'm trying to be better about how do I set those boundaries? How do I be clear about what I want? And now on Mother's Day to say like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go have brunch with my friends. I don't really want to have breakfast in bed. Like, see you later. And
Yeah.
being okay
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah. And adapting to, again, going back to that self-reflection of what is it that I want? Here's how I'm adapting to this new role. And I love that you shared that story about Mother's Day. I felt the same way. I think my son was actually maybe 5 months. And after a traumatic birth, it was very hard for me to just want to enjoy because there was a lot of self-reflection that I was still processing and a lot of like
Yeah.
trauma that I was still processing from that experience that didn't allow me to have full peace in that
Right.
enjoyment of celebrating the journey. And even at his first birthday, there was a lot of mixed feelings, right? Grateful for him to be where he was at, but also reflection of, wow, we went through the hardest year I've ever experienced. And not just because I was a mom, but because of all that other trauma, physical, emotional, all of that. And so love that, love learning to adapt to that ever changing role. And in the work that you do and, the presentations you've made across the country, do you find that what is I guess the hardest thing about women learning to adapt to that changing role? Like, why do they struggle so much with that new identity, in your opinion?
So, in my opinion, and in the feedback that I've gotten, so kind of collectively with the data that I've received, a lot of it just has to do with larger expectations that are placed on us
Yeah.
as women, that it's supposed to be natural to become a mother, that it's just part of what we're kind of built to do. And I think just there's a lot of pressure and the
Yeah.
roles that are prescribed to us, right? Like there's a role as a woman that's already prescribed to you versus a role that you choose. So thinking about how do I define being a mother? And that to me came up a lot is just like, what are the pressures on us to operate in a certain way? And everyone says, congratulations when you have a baby and like are so excited, or when you're pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm like, well, when I got my PhD, people were still excited, but it was totally different. So the
Yes.
expectations, what's celebrated is totally different.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think this is pan cultural, but marriage, get married, have the baby, get a house. I mean, that was what is ingrained. Obviously, me becoming a physician, you becoming a PhD doctor as well. There was obviously some, oh, great, awesome. But there definitely was more like, well, that's great that you're a doctor, but like, we got to find someone for you to get married to and have the kid. And like you said, that expectation of like, well, I got to be great at this and I got to be great at this. And that can really lead to a lot of friction, in feelings. And I appreciate you bringing that up. And then that P in the SNAP framework, the processing of the stress, the burnout, and the trauma. Obviously, this is a loaded process. And I know you also went through that. And you had alluded to the fact that you didn't experience a traumatic birth, quote unquote, but you did have I would say like, seeing your child blue is not an easy experience. So where, where would a person begin in sort of that processing journey, and why is that important?
So I love thinking about this, and one of my faculty colleagues really helped me understand the difference between stress, burnout, and trauma, and really looking at how the lowercase t traumas that we experience in our lives build up over time, even the pandemic being something that we've collectively
Yes.
experienced, that everyone has experienced some kind of trauma, and all of the other things just kind of build up along the way. To me, all of those things adding up were the same as experiencing like a major trauma, like the loss of a parent. My father passed away last year, so that was like a major
Sorry about that.
oh, thank you. That was like a major trauma that people kind of consider this is a big deal. But I had felt like so much trauma, even in just his health journey. There were so many small things that came up along the way that made it almost easier to deal with the major challenge because it's just a constant process. So to me, that was really important to understand that we're all experiencing the lowercase t traumas, and that builds up in us over time and then has this kind of physical effect on our body. So my last kind of major lesson in this, which I'm still learning, is that I had I have moderate kidney damage from, I believe, that is connected to some of the stressful experiences that I've had and the way that I've not coped to take care of myself. So my eating habits, my physical health, my stress levels, my blood pressure. So my blood pressure was chronically high. I think that contributed to some of the other health issues that I had. But kind of really all of this coming to a head and saying, I really need to adapt the way I operate on a daily basis so that I'm ready for the stressful situations and not just when there's stress, I need to cope with it. It's that every single day I have to practice. How am I going to cope with stress?
Yeah, I mean, because like you said, it's the big examples, but also the little things that seem little, not even little T's, but just the day-to-day inconveniences that we may sometimes call, again, if you're so used to having things a routine, control, and anything that disrupts that routine and control can feel overwhelming. And I use the example, you brought up that I went from vacation mode to coming back into work. I was really struggling because it was a week. Not only was it a week of vacation, but it was a real vacation, the first real vacation, meaning no children were there. So having to make no decisions about another human being for 4 days and then only about myself, wake up when I want. I mean, it sounds like an amazing experience because it was. And then the switch the next day to have to take care of the kids and be like, wait, what? You need 3 meals a day and I got to figure out what those meals are. And I got to figure out, putting you down for a nap and, routine and schedule. So that transition, although it was not obviously by any means traumatic or anything, it was a transition that was a little bit of like, wow, well, this is an event. And so I think I relate to you because I struggle a lot with that. I'm doing so much better work of like trying to manage that, stress and burnout and all that trauma, but that day-to-day stress, right? The things that shouldn't really have bothered me, but it does. And recognizing that and saying, well, here it is. I'm feeling this way. How do I get to a point where I don't want to keep feeling this way when life keeps throwing me these small inconveniences, like the internet going out? I know some people listening to this will be like, big deal. But for me, having come back from a week away, having a gazillion things to do for work and the internet being out in my house was like meltdown mode. And I share that honestly and transparently because like you did, it sounds little. It sounds like a huge first world problem, if you will, but it is a reality. And I know so many women relate to that sort of like the little thing all of a sudden triggering them, like that. It wasn't just the internet. It was a accumulation of a lot of different things that led up to that internet issue. And that was just the final straw, if you will.
Yeah. And I mean, I can imagine for myself, at least, I was away for a few days also, but I had this experience of, I asked 3 people to take on a task that I knew I wasn't going to have the bandwidth to do then or when I came back, and none of them did it.
Oh gosh. Yeah, you're like, why? Yeah.
Like I controlled the boundaries, right? I was like, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to delegate. This is what everyone tells you to do. And then like you said, I was really triggered by that and had to take a while, maybe 20 minutes to like do some breathing and do some kind of recalibrating to think, okay, I can't control that they didn't do that. But what can I control? I don't need to answer all 80 of those emails that didn't get answered, but I can do 3 a day. And hopefully I can go and talk to them when I get back to the office. But without processing that, I can just go into the office and feel like I'm on fire. Everything's on fire, and I have operated in a chronic stress for decades. So I would used to say my anxiety is always a 7 out of 10, like as a joke, and not realizing that that's actually really unhealthy. So figuring that out and like developing some tools to do that has made a big impact.
Well, I think that is such a key message to the entire conversation that we've had already, is that sort of insight into not just saying and putting under the brushing it under the rug that, oh, it's just what it is, right? Like, I'm anxious, the 7 out of 10. I also have lived with anxiety for a long time, and it wasn't until the last 4 years, especially the last, I would say, 6 months, that I've actually proactively tried to really help unlock a lot of those systems that have caused me to have anxiety, and that's through therapy,
Yeah.
and I know, I've spoken a lot about therapy on this show, in personal episodes, but also with other guests, and how important it was for me to find that right therapist to help unlock a lot of that sort of, why am I like this? Why is change so hard for me? Why do I deal with perfectionism and people pleasing and all of that? Because that can come from somewhere. And I think, to your point, it can really help in that sort of processing of stress, burnout, and trauma. And I think many women don't realize something that is probably in their system and being held on physically. Like you
Yeah.
said, like you were holding on to a lot of that stress and it manifested as kidney problems for you. I don't think people realize it until it actually becomes something serious. And so I love that you brought that up, because yeah, like I was waking up with palpitations and I'm like, this isn't
Mm-hmm.
normal. This is anxiety. Like, if it's not anxiety, I got to go see a cardiologist, right? Like,
Right.
really listen to your body and listen to what your body and your mind is telling you, and don't brush it under the rug and say, well, this is just motherhood, because it doesn't
Right.
have to be that way, you know?
Yeah. Or that like Instagram post that says, I'll get back to you when things slow down, saying that until you die. Um,
Yes.
and
Yes.
recognizing that it is possible to slow things down, even when everything around you is chaos, to like make time for specific things. But it's a long process and it's a long
Yeah.
journey and it's constant. And it can be tiring to be constantly working on that. But it just has so much payoff in the long run, I find.
And part of that snap to impact framework, obviously one of the portions of it isn't making an impact. What does that mean to you in terms of, after we've kind of gone through the SNAP, what does that mean to impact?
So to me, it's about how do I take kind of the lessons that I've learned in change in my own experience. And of course, you and I have similarities, but we also have very different experiences.
Yeah.
And be able to share that, which is why I appreciate what you do so much. So being open, kind of taking stigma out of things and sharing what works for me, knowing that that may not work necessarily for someone else. So what does a healing process look like for me? I do a lot of like brain retraining and like nervous system work. So a lot of
Mm-hmm.
kind of breath work and meditation, but combining lots of things, knowing that just meditation did not work for me.
Yeah.
Or knowing that, I exercise a lot, that didn't necessarily just do it for me either. It's a combination of a lot of things. So to be able to share my experience, but also acknowledge that this is a process and this can be hard, that I found the solution and it's all solved. And everything is great. Like that, I hesitate when people share things that work for them and act as though it's the solution for everyone.
Yeah.
But just giving a little bit of nuance to, this actually did help me. So you can explore it, not explore it, but it gives you another tool to think about.
Oh, I love it. I'm so grateful. Thank you so much for talking about my platform, and I really appreciate that, because my platform, I know people get a lot of information from my platform and they feel supported, but I don't think people truly understand how much the platform has helped me process a lot of that not so great stuff that's happened in the last 4 years, with birth trauma, IVF being its own grief and traumatic experience. And just by talking about it, seeing someone say, wow, no one ever talked about it like this, or I've never felt, I felt so alone and now I feel seen. I'm like, wow, I feel better. And even my therapist, when I talk to my therapist, she's like, you seem great. I'm like, yes, telling stories and
Mm,
connecting over shared experiences. I think so
hmm.
much of the time we feel this sort of, isolation in motherhood, that I'm the only one dealing with this. And although, like you brought up beautifully, although we may go through very different experiences, the unifying feel is that we all want connection. We all want to be
Right.
seen. We all want that sort of feeling, even if our experiences are different. And we all want to feel peace, I think. I don't think any single mom listening, or dad listening, or caregiver wants to feel stressed and anxious and worried all the time. I think we all crave peace. I know I do. I think it's just
We
such a
deserve
beautiful
it. We
thing.
deserve it.
Yes. Yeah. And it's possible. I think the beautiful thing is being a pediatrician, I've seen so many different families come through my door, right? I see families who have, lower socioeconomic status, multiple children, mom is working 4 jobs. I see the higher socioeconomic mom, 1 child, super overwhelmed. I see all of these people coming into my office, and it's always interesting to me that there is no equation of like checkbox of happiness, right? I
Yeah.
really do believe it's internal work. It's internal work of understanding, here are my resources, here is what the cards I have in my hand. How am I going to use the framework that you mentioned, right? The self-reflection, navigating uncertainty, adapting to changing rules, processing stress. How am I going to use all of that with what I have right now to bring more joy? And so I think it's such a beautiful process. I think it's possible. And I think it's work that seems hard because it is. And I think that's important that people realize.
Yeah, and I think, there are different stages in your life, right? And there are folks in certain circumstances that this is going to be a lot harder.
Yeah.
And, acknowledging the privilege that I have to have the space, to have the time to be able to make time for these types of conversations, to make time for that work, is key. And I know that that's not necessarily possible for everyone on a larger scale, but there are still small things,
Yes.
I think, like you said, that everyone can kind of do to bring some kind of joy to their life or to their experience. So I appreciate you kind of giving a perspective of lots of different families and what that looks like for different people.
Yeah, I mean, anytime I get a mom in my office that in my perception, right? Of course, this is a perception. I'm like, wow, you got a lot on your plate. And she seems so together, meaning so calm, so confident. I ask her I always like to chat with women about their secret, right? Like, why, how are you doing? Like, and a lot of the words that I get back is a mentality of, I just have learned that life will always throw me something and I'm just going to learn to adapt. And it's exactly what you said, right? It's the ability to adapt and to, be able to say, I know it's not always going to be easy. Like, I know my life is hard. And I think you and I have been through those experiences. I went through 3.5 years, I would say, a very difficult time. And that was my first 3.5 years of motherhood, right? And I mean, you look back at it and you're like, wow, I could say to myself, oh, I feel robbed or but that doesn't change the fact that it happened and I need to move forward, right? So it is a mindset at that point that, yeah, that time was hard, but now at this moment, it's okay. And let's celebrate the difficult time, but also celebrate equally when you get out of those moments that were so difficult and you've reached the other side of that life transition. I think it's such a beautiful moment when you finally look back and be like, I did that. I went back to work. I became a mom. My child's finally sleeping through the night. Whatever it is that you're celebrating,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful thing.
Yeah, celebrating and then not celebrating alone, right? So the last
Yeah.
kind of piece of the impact to me is finding the community wherever you can find it. I've found my daughter's now in kindergarten, and so now that we're in the school system in our neighborhood, I found it's a lot easier to meet other
Yeah.
parents. And so that's been really impactful for me this year. But in the first, like you said, kind of 3.5 years plus the pandemic being in there, just very isolating. And knowing that
Yeah.
historically, evolutionarily, we're not meant to do this alone. So being able to celebrate that with others, and finding support wherever you can, whatever that looks like for you, is important too.
Well, Krista, this was an amazing conversation. You provided so many pearls already, but what would be your final message for everyone tuning in today?
I feel like my final message would really be to take yourself and your needs very seriously, whether that's physically in your body, mentally in your mind, emotionally, and really translate that into action. So it's really that the crux of all of this is self-reflection. What's really going on with you? And then what is one small thing in 3 minutes that you can do today to adapt that? And then the next
Yeah.
day might be something different. So to me, it's drilling it down rather than getting overwhelmed by all that we've talked about, and doing it on a regular day, a day that's not a day when you're in crisis. So just finding a couple of minutes to figure out where are you at, pausing, what's going on, and then taking some kind of action. Even if it's before sending an email, if it's before, playing Barbies for an
Yeah.
hour, like where are you at, and what can you manage at that moment?
Well, as a account that does a lot of parenting stuff, how much does that apply to children, right? You said not in a moment where you're in chaos, or, obviously same thing with like kids, right? Like we tend to want to fix things in dysregulated modes, but you got to get yourself regulated, just like we talk about with our children, with ourselves too. You cannot have that self-shame. You can't get into that whole cycle, and you got to be kinder to yourself. Krista, this was amazing. Where can people learn more about you and the work that you're doing, and more about the Snap to Impact framework as well?
So I have a website. It's drkristaklein.com. I have free resources on there, and there's ways for folks to connect with me directly. I also I have my Instagram account, Dr. Krista Klein, and I have LinkedIn where I post pretty frequently, kind of long form, almost blog posts. And you can find me at Krista Klein on LinkedIn as well. So really anything Dr. Krista Klein, typically you can find me, but starting with the website, you'll get to everything else.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. This was such an amazing, enlightening conversation. And I think it's so important for us to hear, obviously, because we all will find ourselves in these transitions if we don't even feel like we've been in them already. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been great. Wonderful. Love talking to you.
Thanks for tuning in. If you love this conversation, make sure to hit that thumbs up sign, share this episode on your social media channels, and subscribe to this channel to stay up to date on all future episodes and our weekly educational videos. Have questions or comments? Make sure to comment below, and I'll see you all next time. Stay well, stay loved, and keep on shining.